Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to this session. My name's Simon Ruda. I head up international development at the Behavioural Insights team. One of the extraordinary benefits of organizing a conference of this stage, of this magnitude rather, is that it's much easier to get the speakers that you really want to speak. And so as a result, we have an extraordinary selection of speakers today, and many of them, partly because we didn't really expect them all to say yes. But it's an absolute privilege. So we're going to divide this session into two. The first half will focus on designing behavioral interventions. It's going to be chaired by Senior Director of the Poverty and Equity Global Practice at the World Bank, Anna Revenga. The second section will be chaired by Nick Dyer of DFID, and that will focus more on implementing behavioral interventions. So, without further ado, let me hand over to Anna, and off we go.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session on nudging for international development. Very pleased to be co-chairing this session with our colleague Nick. We have some fantastic speakers lined up. We are going to divide this into two parts, as we just heard. It's really a session about how to use behavioral and apply behavioral insights in practice, in particular to support development programs and development goals. And the first part is really going to focus on how it is that practitioners, academics, come up with their ideas for interventions. It's the question that, as someone who doesn't work in the behavioral field, I always ask is how do you go from understanding behaviors, behavioral insights, to actually designing a concrete intervention, that little paragraph at the end of the letter or the little SMS that you're going to send to parents to try to make them better parents. And so our speakers are going to talk about that. They're going to talk about the steps that they take in designing a policy solution. We have a very good panel, superb panel. Our first presenter is Danielle Ariely, who I think many of you got to enjoy in this morning's session and who barely needs, I think, any introduction to this audience. But still, for those of you who need a reminder, he is a professor of psychology and behavioral economics at Duke University. Bloomberg named him in 2013 as one of the top 50 most influential thinkers. He's a founding member of the Center for Advanced Hindsight and the author of 3 best-selling books. I've only read the first, Predictably Irrational, The Upside of Irrationality, and The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. So we're going to give the floor to Dan. You have, I've been told to be very strict, you have 8 minutes. So good luck.
Strict is good. Okay, so I want to describe to you an experiment we just finished conducting and get you to predict what you think the results would look like. So this is an experiment we carried out in Kibera. This is slum in Kenya, and we were trying to get people to save a little bit of money. And the first principle of this idea is to create a self-control mechanism, right? So what's the problem? If you give very poor people some money in their pocket, what do they want to do? They want to buy some stuff, not drugs and alcohol and party supplies, but they want to buy better foods and more kerosene and so on. So we need to create a mechanism that gets them to have an easy time putting the money in, but a hard time taking the money out. That's kind of the first principle. So we teamed up with Safaricom, the cell phone company in Kenya, and with an investment bank. And basically people could text money in, but every night the investment bank would take the money from their account on their phone and move it into the investment vehicle. So that meant that people could text money in, but to get it out, they would have to take a bus, go to the city, fill a piece of paper, wait for the money to come out and take it back. So it was possible, and if there was a real emergency, they could get the money, but not everything became an emergency. That was the first principle, and we gave this mechanism to lots and lots of people. And then we had a randomized control trial in which different people got different things. So some people got only this mechanism. Some people got this mechanism, plus every Thursday we texted them and we said, hey, it would be a nice idea to try and save about 100 shillings this week. Some people got the same text message, but as if it came from their kids. we knew the name of their kids, and the message said something like, "Hi, Mom, hi, Dad, this is little Johnny." The name was different. It would be a good idea to try and save about 100 shillings this week. Now, these people know that their kids don't have a cell phone. That's not a mystery, but it was to get them to think about their family. Other people got a 10% match. Save this amount, and we will, at the end of the week, give you 10% up to 100 shillings. Other people got 20% match. Other people got 10% pre-match. What's a pre-match? Pre-match is when we put the money in the beginning of the week in their account, and we say, if you save, you get to keep this money. If you don't, we take it away from you. This is using the principle of loss aversion. You're all familiar with this. And the idea was that people would be worried about losing money. And even if they will not be worried, experiencing this a couple of times would get them to see money going into their account and out of their account. And this will be sufficiently unpleasant so that they will save. And if you think about the difference between the two, if you get the money at the end of the week, the match, you just don't see the money that you gave up. But if it comes in the beginning of the week, it's just very salient on a weekly basis how much money you've given up. And finally, for another group, we created a coin. This was a coin in a gold color. We told them it was not gold. It had 24 numbers etched on the edges of it. And we said, please put it somewhere in your hut. And every week, take a knife out and scratch the number for that week. Week number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Scratch it one way if you save, and scratch it another way if you didn't save. We had some combination of those, but I think that's enough. So now let me ask you, which one do you think created the highest level of savings? So let's go over those and ask you to vote. How many people think that just the text reminder worked the best? One. It didn't. But how many of you think it helped compared to not providing any reminder? That's right. So good thing for reminders. Reminder worked. They actually increased savings substantially compared to no reminders, but it was not the best. How many of you think that text message from their kids, as if it came from their kids, worked the best? Okay, a few. How many people think that 10% post-match worked the best? That 20% post-match? 10% pre-match? 20% pre-match? Oh, okay, it's okay. It's okay. You don't have to. It's not about consistency. How many people think that the coin worked the best? Okay. So here's basically the results. The method itself created. You show me like a white paper. What does it say on it? 5. I can't see from here. So. Okay. So what happened? Texting helped and helped nicely. 10% post-match was slightly better. 20% post-match was just like the 10%. 10% pre-match was slightly better. 20% and 10% again were the same. Kids are just like 10% pre-match. If you're at the age that you're wondering if you should have kids or not, that's basically what they're worth. The coin was the big surprise because the coin doubled savings compared to everything else. Now, we call our research center the Center for Advanced Hindsight. And we call it the Center for Advanced Hindsight for exactly the same feeling that you're feeling right now, which is basically, oh, I knew that all along. It's true that I voted for something else, but I really knew that. And you know, we call the center this way because it's so easy to convince ourselves that we knew things, us as researchers and so on. But now that we know this, why do you think the coin worked so well? Oh, by the way, I brought some coins. This is also part of the discussion on dishonesty because we'll see how many I get back. So now that we know the coins worked so well, why do you think it worked so well? Why would it be? So let me tell you about another study. This was a study in which they took kids in Oklahoma in the US, and they randomly opened to half of them college savings accounts on the day that they were born. And they put less than $1,000 in these college savings accounts, not enough to pay for college. And 2 years ago, these kids turned 4, and they tested their cognitive and social skills. And guess what? Kids with college savings accounts had higher cognitive and social skills. Now, how can that be? Do you think that these 4-year-old kids know that they're going to college? Of course not, but their parents know. And once a month, the parents get a reminder that these kids are headed to college, or there's some probability that they'll head to college. Now, think about what it means for a parent to get a piece of paper that says, this little kid is going to college. What do? Do they read to them 2 more minutes a day? Do they buy them another book from time to time? What are the small effects that this could happen? You know, we often think about statements that we send people as kind of accounting for the past. But the fact is that what we should really care is how they're going to influence the future. What is the mindset that we want to give people? Well, the same thing happened with the coin. If you look at the days of the week and you said, when do people save? In all conditions, people saved on Thursday, a little bit on Friday. People save on Thursday, that's the day they got a text message. Some people have a SIM card, but they don't have a phone. So they put their SIM card in somebody else's phone, they get a text message on Friday, and they save on Friday. In the coin condition, people saved also on the other days of the week. Think about what it means. It means that we have something physical in the environment where people live, and from time to time they think about it. Maybe not a lot, but enough. This, by the way, is also important to think about. How do we think about electronic communication? When do you think about an app on your phone? Only when you think about it, right? It kind of has to come from the inside. Whereas if we do tangible things in the outside world, we can actually change people's mindset independent of what actually is in their mind at that point. The last thing I want to tell you, it's kind of a random thought, but why did we use this coin? Well, how did we get to this? It wasn't a deep, thoughtful idea, but so a few years ago, I decided to prepare for my death. Not really, but I thought, I need to figure out wills and how I leave money for my wife and kids and all that stuff. And it's incredibly cumbersome. And I thought that what I really wanted to do was I wanted to create a coin with a serial number and a phone number, and I wanted to give it to my wife, and I wanted to tell her that if something ever happened to me, just call this number, tell them this number on the bottom, the serial number, and somebody would handle all the details. You don't have to worry about. And I also wanted her to not lose it. So I thought, if I give her a piece of paper, what are the odds that she will keep it? Not very high. So I thought maybe I make it look as if it's valuable, kind of maybe a gold color or something like that. So I've been thinking a lot about this tangible question. And on top of that, when I was in South Africa, people buy funeral insurance. These are very poor people who buy funeral insurance that maybe for a month. And there's kind of an interesting ceremony in which they give that piece of paper with the funeral insurance to their firstborn child or the significant other, and basically saying, if I die this month, here is the thing that would help you out. And it felt to me that as they were handing this over, there was kind of a ceremony of, here I am doing my job as the head of household or the breadwinner of the family. So I think there's lots of things like that we should think about tapping out. By the way, so clearly this coin was like a random, not very articulated, not very scientific thought, but it worked, right? So sometimes it's good to try those things. But for me, I think that the question of what are the reminders about financial decision-making that would tap into these issues of both memory and identity and the feeling for the head of household that they're actually doing their job in the right way, those are important things to figure out. And maybe if we manage to harness them, we can get people to save a bit more for a rainy day. And thank you.
Yeah, if you don't mind, they want us to then stay here for the questions and answers. Hopefully you can still see the slide. Thank you very much, Dan, for that very disciplined 8-minute presentation and that fascinating. I confess I certainly didn't get the answer right. And in hindsight, I would still not get it right. I'm still trying to get my head around how the coin works, but it was a fascinating presentation. Our second presentation is going to take us to the domain of taxes. And we have as a presenter a colleague of mine from the World Bank, Marco Hernandez, who's a senior economist. And he has done a lot of work in Latin America, in Europe and Central Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. He's been one of the people, one of the growing but still limited number of people at the World Bank who's been trying to apply behavioral insights to improve policy. And his particular area is macro and fiscal policy management. Marco?
Hello, everyone. Let me turn this on. Actually, let me speak here then. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I was in a session on taxes just before coming here. And, some said that there are two things that are certain in life, death and taxes. But in developing countries, that's not so certain, right? And indeed, it's actually a huge development priority, because these countries not only need to mobilize revenues to spend on health, education, and infrastructure, and so forth, but also the culture around paying taxes is completely different to OECD countries. So we wanted to understand this a little bit better and try to see, what will be the things that will be important around it. And we start with this question, is how might we increase tax compliance at a low cost and without new legislation? In particular, we know that changing tax policy is very costly, it's politically difficult, it takes time. So how can we do this a little bit better? And that's how we find that behavioral insights can actually help us. And we know that penalties matter, but compliance is also affected by many other factors. It could be social norms and other things. So applying those behavioral insights is incredibly useful, especially taking into account that sometimes they take only small changes to existing processes and also using existing data. So I wanted to share with you today just 3 examples of what things that we've been doing in this particular area, and it would be really good to get your feedback about them. So the first example is from Guatemala. Guatemala is one of the countries that has the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. And not surprisingly, they also are one of the countries that has spent the lowest in the world as a share of GDP. Meanwhile, you have more than half of the 15 million Guatemalans that live below the poverty line. So therefore, raising revenues is a key priority. So what do we do? In this particular example, which we also work with the Behavioral Insights team, following the lead of some of the trials that have been done here in the UK. And we wanted to see if applying behavioral insights would actually work in a developing context like Guatemala, where this behavior was very much entrenched. And the examples or details of this particular example are also in the annual report that you received yesterday from the BAT if you want to learn more about it. So in Guatemala, like most tax authorities around the world, the Guatemalan tax authority sends letters to the taxpayers reminding them that they need to pay their income tax. And we wanted to see if simplifying those letters matter because they include a lot of legal jargon and sometimes information that is not necessarily easy to follow. In addition to that, we wanted to test different messages, different behavioral messages. And so we decided to have 5 different letters. One of them was actually the original letter that was sent by the tax authority, and the other 4 were adapted using behavioral insights. So one of the letters, for example, had a national pride message. You're a Guatemalan citizen, Guatemala needs you, please pay your tax. Another one had changing the framing of the decision as a deliberate choice. So telling the taxpayer, previously we've considered your fault as an omission, but if you don't declare now, we're going to consider that is your active choice. We also had a social norm one, very similar to the one in the UK, but the norm here in Guatemala was a lot lower. So, 64.5% of Guatemalans have already declared their taxes. You're part of the minority who has not. So the first thing that we found is that, of course, the behavioral messages had a very big impact. And they not only increase the rates of declaration and the rates of payment, but they also increase the amount paid. And this is the example that I'm showing in this graph, where the 2 most successful letters actually had a big increase in the amount paid by the taxpayers. And something that we found that was very, very interesting was the impact that it had, and also in terms of how it was changing the processes within the tax authority. And the return to investment for these ones were about 35 times, so very, very high. And we collected also data 1 year later. And what we found 2 things that were super interesting. One of them was that the effects were persistent 1 year later. And the second thing that we found is that actually the 2 most successful letters were very good at increasing declaration rates the following year without any further reminder. So that tells us something about building habits. And this increase was 16% for the two most successful letters. So very, very important. So let me turn to the second example, which is Costa Rica. In Costa Rica, we're working with the tax authorities, and they were very interested in using third-party information to build their taxes. So what is third-party information? Basically, you ask other firms, for information about one particular firm, the activities of one particular firm. For instance, their credit card transactions or the sales that they have between different firms. This third-party information is very much used in OECD countries, but is much less common in developing countries. So we wanted to see what would be the impact here. So we sent emails, which were cheaper than letters. And what we found is that they also increased declaration rates, they also increased payment rates and the amount paid. Highlighting the third-party information, giving them a particular example. We know that you had sales of X amount with this particular company, or you had this many transactions of the credit card with this particular bank, had an additional small effect on compliance. And this effect was larger the more we knew about that particular firm. So the more third-party information coverage they had, the greater was the effect. So here we have two gray bars to the left, and this was the impact that the treatment had for companies that did not have detailed third-party information at the time that we designed the trial. And the two bars on the right for those companies that had detailed third-party information. So the effect is larger, but something else that we found is that it also had a spillover effects. Actually, those companies that got the example that you had this particular transaction or this particular sales amount actually were more likely to become third-party informants themselves in the future. The final example is from Poland. And here we worked with the subnational level with two tax offices, and they were very interested to change their strategy around how they communicate with taxpayers. And the strategy they had been using was sending these reminder letters with a very formal tone. So we wanted to see if actually changing the tone of the letter to a more informal tone or a more mild tone would actually have an impact. And this is the result of this particular trial. So we had a standard formal letter and an informal letter. And the main results were that they also increased payment rates by 8%. This is over and above the standard letter. They doubled it in comparison to the control group. The amount paid was also increased significantly, and the tax debt was reduced. And all of these trials were tested at only 4, 11 weeks, and 24 weeks afterwards. So these impacts were, of course, coming very quickly. And we know that making it easy matters. So we said, what if we test something around making things easy? So we also incorporated in the design of this experiment, sending a payment form with inclusion of the letter. So for some letters, we only sent the letter, and the other letters had the letter plus a payment form. And including a payment form actually helped them to increase further the payment rates by 4%. So again, very significant, very cost-effective. And we're continuing working with these tax authorities, sending up new trials, using websites and other things, SMS, and wanted to see also what are the different impacts between economic sectors, different reaches of the country, what's the difference between men and women, etc. And I think that that's where we're heading in this type of arena to really try to understand the different types of behavior. I just wanted to leave with 3 main takeaways from our engagement. The first one is that we're learning fast with few resources. We know that not everything that we test is going to work. So that's why it's very, very important to do it in the most rigorous way possible. Second, that there is great potential for scalability. We get a lot of requests now, even from the tax authorities, saying, actually, it's great that we're improving tax collection. We also have, some policy issues related to energy conservation and whatnot. And establishing the process is much more important than the results of the experiments itself. Actually, institutionalizing the application of behavioral insights is a critical component of what we're trying to do, and we're looking forward to continue working. So looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we've covered 4 countries. And now we're going to move on to our third speaker, who I think will take us to yet another part of the world. Our third speaker is Nava Ashraf, who's associate professor at Harvard Business School. Her research is focused on testing insights from behavioral sciences in the area of global development in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. She has a long list of publications in top journals, and please join us. Thank you very much. You're going to use this, or do you want this?
Great. It's fantastic to have this session because we know that, when we think about health, education, development, these are not things that we give to people. They're things that people produce themselves. And so when we think about producing development, it's really something that is produced by the individuals who come and access the services, the products, the programs, the policies that we try to design. And so if we don't understand how they're thinking about it, then we can't allow them to produce the kind of health and education and economic development that we're aiming at. This is a picture from a public health clinic that I've been working at outside of Lusaka, Zambia, for the last probably 7 years, who've been wonderful partners for me. And it's just one instance of the nexus of co-production of development, where of health, where the patient has to come and access services, and the provider has to provide those services well. And on both sides, the sort of demand side and the supply side, we want to understand the factors underlying them. So I won't get a chance to talk a little bit about the kind of products that we have designed on the demand side within development that have accessed that. And there I would just like to highlight that one of the things we really try to do is to use, and I think a lot of behavioral economics has gone in that realm of using what we have previously seen as obstacles instead as levers, and really ways of helping generate the change. I'm going to focus this very short presentation on the supply side, which is thinking about all those providers. And the way that I came just to this question of how do academics come up with their questions, essentially I'd been focusing on designing products, getting people to save more, work on their health, et cetera, and realized, boy, it's really important who's providing these to people and what their motivations are, because that, in fact, can be one of the biggest aspects of persuasion. So then that led to trying to understand what motivates them. And I think when you have very limited resources and you can't use financial resources extensively, and even given the research that we have of how much sometimes even things like pay performance don't have the impact that we think they could have, it really there's a huge role to be played in the value of non-financial motivators and non-financial incentives. So we have a series of papers with Oriana Bandiera and Kelsey Jack, and I'll show you one with Scott Lee as well, that focus on these kind of non-monetary motivators and incentives. So the first one I'll briefly mention, and then another one I'll go much more in depth with. The second one was with the government of Zambia. It was a national program. The first one was in Lusaka, and it was with 4,000 hairdressers and barbers who are not the way you would usually think of as health promoters. They're certainly not like the nurse in that picture, but given that there are so few nurses, the idea was, can you think about more innovative distribution channels that can help to promote health in the communities? And in particular, there was a new innovative technology, which was the only way that women have to protect themselves against HIV, which are female condoms. And the idea was, how do you get those out to the communities and convince people to use them? Hairdressers and barbers are everywhere in Africa, as everyone knows. They're on every street corner. People understand and connect with them tremendously. And the idea here was just to see how you want to treat them as distributors that you provide financial margins to, or as NGO workers that are motivated by volunteering for the community. So we took basically all of the hairdressers in and barbers in Lusaka. We geocoded them, and we randomized them into 4 treatment conditions of how they were going to be incentivized to sell female condoms and promote HIV prevention. In a quarter of the hairdressers and barbers, we had a pure volunteer condition, come and be part of this mission. In a quarter, we had a 10% financial margin on selling the female condoms. A quarter, we had a 90% financial margin. And the last quarter, we created a social recognition treatment that was essentially a thermometer you put up in your salon or barbershop, and every female condom you sold, you got a star, and as it went up, it said your contribution to community health. So I'll do the same thing as Dan said, you can think about which one you would have predicted. This is the results. So the stars had twice as powerful a treatment as the low financial margin and the high financial margin, which were actually about the same as the volunteer treatment. Now, even at the highest, even at the 90% margin level, this wasn't something that made a lot of money for people, and let's remember that the hairdressers and barbers, they have different opportunities to make money. They can sell wigs, they can sell phone cards, etc. They had very little opportunity to feel their contribution to community health, and that seems to be what's underlying the mechanism of this social recognition. And there was a public aspect to it as well, and so there's a number of mechanisms that were there. But that led to a lot of conversations around the value of non-monetary incentives. The paper is called No Margin, No Mission because the organization we were working with, one of the main social marketing organizations in the world, Population Service International, had this philosophy that if you don't provide people a financial margin, they won't have a mission, and this was sort of going against that. And so, the government and in the Ministry of Health had found out that we had done this study, and they asked me to help them design incentives for a new cadre of civil servant that was starting, because it's a setting where, like most countries in Africa, there is a huge disease burden and very, very few human resources for health. And so the challenge there was, I mean, just to give you a sense, when we started this project, there's 12 million people in Zambia, 946 doctors. And most of them are in Lusaka. They're not in these remote rural areas where people really need health services. So the way that they wanted to remedy that is to recruit people directly from the communities, give them training for a year, and then send them back out to the communities. And there was this central question of incentivizing. But at that point, we didn't feel comfortable generalizing from these studies. So we did some other ones with them. But the central thing that I'll talk about of the study we did here was actually at the recruitment phase. So, and again, this was very much in dialogue with the government. So we had spent probably 3 years talking with the Ministry of Health as this program was developing, trying to understand what their biggest concerns were. And meanwhile, we were also thinking from our side what would be really interesting questions. And then finally, the program got approved through the Ministry of Finance and Cabinet, and it was a go. And the Human Resource Director said to me, what happens if they're becoming civil servants? What happens if they lose their connection to the community? The whole point of this was to find people who are connected to the community, and there had been such a debate around whether to professionalize this sector or not, because you would find like the worst people, the people who want to advance their career, not the people who are wanting to make the social impact and serve the community. And so that became our question, is if you recruit with the opportunity to advance your career, who are the type of people you bring in, and what's the impact that they have on these communities, versus recruiting with the way centrally things are recruited is through community service. So we, across the entire country, this was in the whole country of Zambia, across 48 districts, half of the districts got a recruitment poster that said, want to serve your community, become a community health worker. Half got a poster that said, want to become a community health worker to gain skills and boost your career. Then, so the people applied differently. Then when they showed up for training, they had 1 year of training together, and they all received the same incentives. They all realized that they had an opportunity to advance their career and to serve the community. But what was different was what was made salient to them about the benefits of the job at the point of recruitment. And what we find is that the career opportunities poster brings in applicants with higher skills, but that may not mean that they make better community health workers when they go back to their communities. So we follow them for 2 years, and what we find is that those who were recruited under the career incentives poster do 30% more visits, which over an 18-month period turns into 20,290 more household visits, which are very difficult to do in these remote areas. And this turns into massive health impact. So through both institutional administrative government data and a national household survey, we find that institutional deliveries go up by 31%, child visits go up by 24%, children on track by immunization goes up by 81%, moderate and severe undernourishment goes down by 25%. So what we've learned there is that these career incentives, making career incentives salient at the point of recruitment, is far more powerful than any incentives even that you could do while people are on the job. And it attracts candidates who perform better and equally likely to remain in their posts. And that these two sources of motivation are not actually in conflict in this particular job. There's lots of caveats that we can get into in the question and answer. But this process of co-generating this knowledge together with the government of Zambia has allowed them to scale up this program. Now they recruit with these posters. And we're now thinking about the rest of the civil service and how to think about recruitment and motivation in that sector.
Does this work? Yeah, it works. I think we had 3 very brief but tantalizing glimpses as to of how applying behavioral insights can actually improve programs and policies in really diverse areas. We talked about savings, we talked about taxes, and we've talked about health provision. We have about 15 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, of questions and answers. We're going to open up to the audience, but before I do, I want to ask the panel one sort of very basic question as someone who works on development policy is, you've presented cases of different countries, very different social, cultural context. How did you go about working in a very different cultural context from probably where most of your work is done? How do you apply your behavioral approach in very different social settings? Does it change anything or does it not? I think Dan talked about having the idea of the coin, thinking about his own. By the way, I like it. I've also been thinking about my will and all that, and it would be nice to have a coin. But how applicable is it, or how much adjustment do you have to do when you move to a very different cultural setting? And you can go in whatever order you want, or you can pass on the question.
I think this is a really important question because when I first finished my PhD, I was working in 3 continents, you know, your usual lots of field experiments, and it was very dissatisfying because I think so many of these behavioral things are subtle, and you need to understand the context. And so, so I've been working only in Zambia for the last 10 years so that I can deeply understand the context. At the same time, I think there has to be some structure. So we can't just say that only context matters, you know, and it just depends, you know, because I do think that we can have some structure, and theory gives us some structure of what to look for in different contexts so that we can accelerate the process when we go into a new environment. I think if there's anything that behavioral economics can teach us for development, it's that there isn't, you know, a silver bullet that then applies everywhere. You really do have to understand how people are thinking and what is motivating them, and have a structured way of understanding that before applying whole scale.
Just to complement Nava, I think, well, details definitely matter greatly, and that's why it's so important to understand the underlying processes behind them. For example, in the case of taxes, we try to do the customer journey, so to really try to understand what are all the different steps that the taxpayer needs to do. How does it apply to one particular context versus other? Is it different between firms and individuals? Is it different between economic sectors and so forth? Is it different when you're submitting your declaration online versus actually sending them on paper? And those details can actually tell us a lot about the decision-making process that the taxpayer is actually facing. And some things actually do work across countries. One particular case is this example of the deliberate choice letter that we sent out in Guatemala, which was basically a translation of one of the experiments that was conducted in the UK. And it did work, but some other things that work very differently, you know, like the formal versus the informal approaches work very different depending on the context. And we were discussing earlier today this importance of how is the trust in one particular context and how is the power actually exerted in another context. And those two things can actually matter, I would say, beyond taxes.
So I'm the most naive about cultural differences. I mostly do experiments in the lab. Actually, when I started my academic career, it was very important for me to get a cross sample. So I was teaching at MIT at the time, and I kind of sampled all the way up to Harvard to get to get the broad range. But so here's my unsupported kind of notion. I think that when we think about deep psychology, people are kind of the same. So actually, I used to work in visual perception. You know, nobody in the field of visual perception thinks that there's cultural differences, right? We all see basically the same. And I think the same thing happens to very basic psychological principles. The question becomes, what happens when we deal with psychological principles that are not that deep, that are not about something like visual perception, how we look at relativity and so on, but about something that is more general? And then how do we look at things that are a combination of things that are more in the social psychology, less in the cognitive psychology part and move into social psychology, when then the nature of the beast changes, right? So I think that's the way I would like us to think about it is to say, when we think about each of those interventions, sometimes those interventions are a basket of psychology. And what we have to do is we have to isolate them and think about what are the psychological elements and which of those elements do we expect to be the same and which of those elements are socially constructed. So that's kind of my unsupported view.
Great, thank you. Excellent answers. Let's see, do we have a microphone in the room somewhere, or do you want just people to be loud? Let's get some questions. I'm having this internal debate. I'm learning about behavior, and yesterday I learned that we should do one question at a time. But I also know that if we do 2 questions at a time, I give the speakers a bit more choice in what to answer. So
Go wild.
Go wild. I'm going to go for 2 answers at a time. No, let's take a couple questions, maybe 2, so we don't forget the questions in the process, and then we'll just do several rounds. So I have somebody, let me start on the left side. I'm kind of left-leaning, so let's take a couple questions from maybe in the back and then in the front.
Hi, so this is a question for Nada. You mentioned theories and frameworks. What kind of theories or frameworks are you talking about? Are they just from sort of general decision-making psychology, or maybe from cross-cultural psychology side?
Wait. We're going to take a second question. I'm going to take 2 questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to you all. And I know you're directing your question at a specific person. If others feel like they want to comment, that's fine too. We had another question up front.
So I would love to know what you think about tailoring nudges. So, for example, the tax study. What about if you went to Guatemala and you knew some people based on their education and their, let's say, gender and a few other aspects would react differently to a nudge? What do you think about the practicality and ethics about tailoring nudges to those people?
Okay, let me move the microphone down to...
What I meant about theory is exactly what Dan was saying about mechanisms. Essentially, we need to understand what the mechanisms are at work, and so you can take the theory from cognitive psychology, social psychology. I'm an economist, so I usually look at the theories that are in economics. It just gives you a structured way to have an explanation for the path that's there so that you can see. So one example is I've done a lot of work on intra-household dynamics, and some of my earlier work was about the roles that husbands and wives take on in managing finances. That is very different across cultures, but there are some very clear predictions if you know 1 or 2 variables, which are, who's supposed to be in charge of the purse versus not, and then you can actually start to predict how people would respond to interventions. So those theories come from sociology, but you can quantify them. They're a way to be structured about how we understand cultural context and how that heterogeneity might respond differently to policy interventions.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. And I think that the issue of practicality and ethics are central to all of this agenda. And we were having a very interesting discussion earlier in the session on taxes about actually the ethics of targeting different messages to different groups. And there are 2 things that I think it will be good to highlight. The first one was that it is very important when you're applying things that have worked in other contexts and you want to see if they have been, they can be also successful in your particular context, that first of all, there are some basic ethical principles that you need to follow through, that when you are unsure about something that you suggest to go through an ethical board, and more importantly, that you also test things at a very small scale so that you can get the feedback from the whole process so that you can continue learning from this. And there is a long history of ethics in RCTs, and I think that all of those insights are now central to the table, and they need to be brought down to center stage. Yeah.
Sure, I think that we should think about the public good, right? How much public good are we creating? And if you basically say, look, we have this intervention and it seems to be working for X population and worse for Y population, but we could do something for Y population, but we think it will be good for them in the same way that it will be good for everybody else. I don't mind giving people different interventions. I really don't see the problem there. Now, there's an issue of do people find out and do feel manipulated and so on, but but this idea that we have we think that people should pay their taxes, for example. I don't think there's a moral issue there. We think that people, should take their antibiotics until they finish, because otherwise they create a problem for everybody else. And some people work with message A and some people work with message B. I'm perfectly fine giving them what works best.
We have, I'm trying to be disciplined because we have another 2 speakers and another round of questions. So I'm going to take 2 questions if they're really quick. I feel like I should have a little gender balance here, so we can ask. I think there's the gentleman in the middle here. You had or in the back, one of you. Go ahead and ask your question. I'll take 2. Please be brief, and we'll have another chance after the next session.
Hi, Joseph Durst. I'm a journalist with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I wanted to ask Mr. Hernandez if he could maybe tell us some more about the Polish tax letters. What does formal and informal mean? Could you just tell us some more about that? What was said on the letters? Exactly. Thank you. Okay,
one more quick question. And I promise that we're going to have some more time at the end of the next round of sessions. So go ahead.
So I just had a question about Dan's study with the coins. I'm sure that you looked at literacy levels, because presumably if people were illiterate or not good reading levels, they might have struggled to read texts with different messages in. And secondly, did you do any kind of investigation as to where they were keeping their coins? Was it in their wallet, in their pocket? Was it like lost in a drawer? How salient was it in the environment?
Sure. Thank you very much for that question. Let me give you just a couple of examples. Part of it has to do with just basic simplification of the letters. In the formal letter that was sent out by the Polish authorities, they mentioned, they made a lot of reference to formal documents, for instance, right? Like some of them will be legal documents, some others will be resolutions or norms, and simplifying that was part of that. And the second was a little bit of a personal touch in the letter as well, and trying to minimize threatening words, whatever they were included in the formal message, to make it a little more of a milder tone.
Okay, so we recruited people for the study from the informal sector. So these are all people that didn't have a stable job, but people who had either a SIM card or a phone, and those people get text message from the cell phone company all the time. We try to make the messages very simple in that regard. But we did not check for literacy, but we randomly assigned people to the conditions, so presumably because the level of the messages were so similar, that cannot explain it. In terms of the coin, we asked them to put it somewhere in their hut, but we didn't get more specific. We actually tried to get the coins back and to kind of see if they scratch them and how often, and can we do something about that? These are really lovely coins. We couldn't get them back.
Yeah, on that note, I have a lovely coin here that I'm really tempted to take with me, but I'm gonna leave her right there for now. I'm gonna hand over. I'd like to ask you all to give a round of applause to our speakers. Please stay. No, we want you to stay on the stage. You're not done working yet. I'm going to get off the stage and switch places with Nick, but you get to do a little bit more work, because we're hoping that some of the questions at the end will come back to the earlier presentations as well, and we will get another round of applause for everybody together at the end. But let me hand over my job's over. Let me hand it over to Nick.
Great, thanks very much, Anna, and thanks to all the panel. As both Anna and Simon said earlier, this part of the sessions about the implementation of behaviour policy. So you've all got something to contribute to that after in the Q&A, so thank you for hanging on. So what we're going to look at is 2 things: how we translate ideas into interventions and the associated problems with that, and also we're going to touch on the behavioural biases that affect people like us. So not people we're trying to work with, but the development professionals. So we've got 2 speakers, Stefan Dercon and Renos Vakis. So first of all, Stefan. Stefan is Chief Economist at DFID and also Professor of Development Economics at Oxford University. Now, it says here in my formal brief that in DFID he's responsible for strategy and research, particularly on the economic aspects of development and the use of evidence to improve quality of development policy. Actually, I know Stefan as a one-off individual challenge function and fantastic ideas factory. That's his real role in DFID, apart from the formal. So, Stefan, you're welcome, and over to you.
It's always a bit strange to get your boss to introduce you, so thank you, Nick. So what I want to talk about is a little bit of the work we've been trying to do within the Department of International Development around behavioral science, trying to bring it into the organization. So the department is, the UK government department responsible for spending and developing its international development actions, spending £12 billion on development. And, it is part of the civil service. And if you think about, how do you try to bring a bit of behavioral science into DFID? So, you could ask yourself, who do you think of when you think of, a civil servant typically? You could have all kinds of images what a civil service is like. But, ultimately, it is quite a challenge because we are both, an organization that has to, a department that has to work within civil service constraints and conditions, lots of meetings, lots of process, lots of things. At the same time, we are quite a group of people, highly motivated, trying to actually really make sure that, we spend the money well, but that we do it to reduce poverty in the world. So you get this kind of interesting contrast. And actually, I was looking just this morning at the pictures that I managed to get. We're a bit more diverse than these pictures seem to imply, and I'm very sorry about that. But, what you do, so how do you bring behavioral science into work? Now, one thing you could do is to actually, listen to things like this, hear about what researchers do, all kinds of exciting experiments. But one of the risks when you do that is that actually you make it something like that's outside yourself. It's nothing to do with you. It's not something that is affecting you. It's a little bit, we'll bring an expert and they'll get us our tax collection. It's nothing to do with us. We thought actually it would also be helpful if we want to actually get some insights of behavioral science to resonate a bit more, to be a bit more internalized, we should work within the organization. So, couldn't we actually do little bits and pieces, fairly superficial things at first, to bring in some bit of experiments within ourselves, very standard things, but actually that help us to challenge a little bit that we also have lots of biases, maybe encourage us to think a little bit slower, and so on and so on. So the one thing for a while we'd been doing already, whenever we had the opportunity, building little RCTs into things we were doing, And it's actually, let me be honest, there was actually almost a little bit of fun to do it. So build a little bit in it and tell people afterwards that they had been part of a little experiment. And so we could have some early results. We could find, surprise, surprise, that in the civil service people respond to authority. Well, how would you do that? Simply, get reminders sent by a junior person for some some simple task. For the same task that also some more senior people do ask as a reminder. Of course, you'll get that the senior people get more response and the tasks are better completed. We also find, which is quite nice to find in the civil service, that it's not so easy to bribe them. So we did also reminders once, and these were reminders coming from me, but they were slightly flippantly saying, and if you do this task, which was filling in a form, you'll be entered in a raffle to win a bottle of champagne. I did in the end give that bottle of champagne, but actually the response rate was lower than just a formal reminder, do your job. So it's nice to know that bribing is not so prevalent and not so easily done, and that's a good thing. That's the kind of thing. So what we did further is then, in the context of the World Development Report, the World Bank decided, and it's in the World Development Report, the Chapter 10, to try to do, its own behavioral and attitude survey. So we actually said early on, let's do this as well in DFID, and use this as a mechanism to actually talk to our staff and make them think a little bit about and expose them to certain things. So we did the same survey as Chapter 10 in the World Development Report. If you haven't seen it, it's nice to see. It's a kind of thing. And, you don't have to remember our results because they're identical to what we found in the World Bank. But we had actually a process, pretty good, large sample, much better response rates in DFID than in the World Bank. But that's another story. But we managed to build in, very simple, and these are essentially a collection of fairly standard classic kind of bits and pieces randomized in this survey. Now, I want to just show you a couple of things that we find. But actually, for me, it's not so much what we find is important, but the fact that we did it and then the conversation we could have afterwards with our staff. So the first one is, the very classic Anna Mantreschi, 1981 in Science, the loss of virgin experiment, telling people there's going to be an epidemic, there's going to be, suppose where you work in the country you are working in is preparing for a new disease that's going to infect 12,000 people. There's some treatment options, and we have scientific evidence of the treatments. All very standard, done like that. Okay, but now wait for a moment. This is actually what our job is. That's the kind of things we do. Ebola, in the end, killed 11,000 people in West Africa. These are the kind of numbers, the kind of things that are our day-to-day job. So when Kahneman and Tversky do it as a little, experiment with all kinds of probably Harvard and MIT students and Stanford students or wherever he was, and very different, this is actually our job. This is what we do. And so the framings are actually things that are framings that we recognize. We can frame it in the loss space, we can frame it in the gain space, where, the choices are either 4,000 people will be saved, or there is a chance that 12,000 people will be saved and 2/3 will not be saved, or exactly the same expected values on the other side, but framed in the loss frame. So we randomized, some people got frame 1, some people got frame 2. And of course, you know what the results are, but I want to repeat again, this is our job, to actually spend taxpayers well, that we make the right choices. This is what we do. So if we find in our organization that we get these kind of results, and we see that over the things that is our fundamental job, that of course we'll get the kind of things that once it's framed in the losses frame, more people are going for the risky option than for the save option, and of course the reverse when it's framed in the gains frame. That shouldn't surprise you, and in fact the World Bank, it's exactly the same results. But it should surprise us because that's our job. That's what we do, that's what we stand for. I went to present this to the National Audit Office. Now, people who know the National Audit Office, these are the accountants of governments, these are the number crunchers, these are the cost-benefit geeks, they are the ones that do everything. And I have only 2 minutes, so I'll go. But you can imagine what these people would be. And I sat in a room like this, and just I showed them the previous slide and said, oh, well, why don't you actually, let's briefly do it here. I hadn't really planned it to say, this room, let's look at frame 1, this room looked at frame 2. They put up their hands, they throw it exactly in the same way as our final results. Not surprising, but these are the ones that should actually, really, they do, the expected values are the same 4 times, but they still have these kind of things. It definitely shocked them, and it definitely surprised them that even they would have them, and so on. So another one is confirmation bias. The standard thing is, we do a careful impact evaluation. This is the kind of thing that's the bread and butter for someone working on impact evaluation, but actually the kind of evidence that we like to present, that we tell our ministers and so on. We have a treatment or not a treatment. Some people get a treatment, other people don't. These are numbers of the people that get better. Some people, and this is a number that don't really get any impact. If you look at this and those who are very quick, you can see what you should conclude from this. But we're getting this actually, well, we did actually slightly, lots of different framings. One case, the framing is about skin cream and different treatments. In another case, it's about minimum wages and the impact on the poor. Now, again, very standard, very nice little thing, randomizing all the columns and things to make sure there is enough, that there is no reason why certain things come out. And this is what you get. The green is actually the number of correct answers on the skin cream vignette. The blue is what you get on the wage vignette. This is random. It should be the same. Okay, it's one thing, take your little notebook out, 1/3 of DFID staff can't do simple impact evaluation, but thank God the World Bank was just as bad. So surely people make errors, and errors will be made when they do this in a survey and do this quickly. But 2/3 got it right when they did the skin cream vignette. Only less than half got it right when it was the minimum wage. And in fact, what we find, that making errors correlates with your underlying own beliefs, whether you're more leftist or right-wing. Exactly as in the World Bank, with a difference, the World Bank is a bit more right-wing than we are. But that's another matter. But you get these correlations with errors, and you get that. Now, that's again important. We are meant to be unbiased civil servants that make a judgment on the evidence. And actually, we again come this out. This is surprising, this is shocking people and done. So finally, what does it mean? For us, it was very much to try to bring out and actually have a dialogue. So a couple of things we do. So something I'm proud of, I'm in charge of it, so I'm quite proud of it, but is actually we have processes in the organization where, independent of the whole spending pillars that are happening, we have actually independent scrutiny. It's internal, but people are really said, you should be independently evaluating whether this is really value for money, whether we should be doing it. Occasionally, I mean, we got lots of trouble with it, and people fight it because, you know, it does influence, and in the end, it goes independently to our ministers for decisions. But actually, it's a good thing. Have someone else to look at it. Of course, you could have peer review things and so on as well, but just have other people to look at it. Other things we're trying to play with is red teams. It's something the UK Armed Forces tend to do. If they do a difficult operation, they will appoint an officer who's going to be the red one, you know, old Cold War language probably, and basically finding any reason why this will fail. Being any reason, and that's the job of that officer. In a hierarchy, now you tell us all the things why it can go wrong. We try to now do it in our processes. Gets once in a while someone, my proposal would be that we buy a red hat and we put the red hat on. You're sitting in the meeting and you're going to be contrary and finding any reason why this doesn't work. We have had, quite interesting and surprisingly influential, we actually got senior people, I will finish now, senior people debating with each other and disagreeing almost violently in public in front of loads of staff. For lots of staff, junior staff, they said, this is never seen this in DFID. It's for me as a senior person quite normal, we disagree amongst each other. But they see it, and they see that you can do it. And then finally, working very hard on ideas that we should try to make sure it's safe to challenge. In fact, it's one of in our surveys that yearly the staff have to fill in. It's a question, and we worry about it, that a lot of staff say it's not safe to challenge in the organization. It's a performance indicator. I'm not saying we're going to necessarily just with this succeed in doing it, but a lot of people at all kinds of levels find it very important that we build in this challenge. Of course, there's lots of other things we can do, and I wish you could help us how we can actually overcome some of these biases. So anyone with great ideas, you know, there's a lot of civil servants that don't mind to be experimented on, and if you have great ideas, let us know. Anything that makes it better, because we want to function well, and we want to use evidence well. We want to be more effective for poverty reduction. Thank you.
Stefan, thank you. And I'd encourage you to sit up on the stage with the
ethics involved in testing civil servants?
We're very happy to be tested. We're also very happy to leave some of our biases at the door when we come in the morning. So our second speaker is going to be Renos Vakis, who's the lead economist in the Poverty and Global Practice at the World Bank, who's written extensively on poverty and development issues across a range of countries, particularly in Latin America and South Asia, who's going to talk to us about implementation of behavior policy.
Thank you. I may be drinking water during presentation. It's not vodka. So we've heard a lot of amazing examples the last couple of days about ideas and behaviors and how those change decision-making, policy, and fantastic impacts. What I want to talk in the next 7.5 minutes is about the nitty details of walking through an intervention, setting up an intervention from the practitioner, the counterpart, and all the things that basically go wrong. So I won't show any impacts because we don't have yet, but I want to just go through it and have a little bit of the what happens and how our own biases and all the things that happen when you actually face reality. And hopefully the presentation will come up. If not, I'll keep going on while it's coming. Basically, we're going to be talking about improving parenting in Nicaragua. Now, why Nicaragua? Nicaragua is the part of the idea of the presentation is to actually talk about a setting where poverty is actually very high, capacities at the local level are very constrained, and yet, as we've been hearing from the panel, these insights are actually universal. And then how do you apply these insights in that type of setting? Now, Nicaragua is the second poorest country in Latin America. And the region we went, and hopefully I'll show pictures soon, it's actually... try next. Was that in a nudge? No. It's an experiment on me, I think. So the region we go, just to give you an idea where we are, imagine you're in Managua, the capital. You have to drive about 4 or 5 hours to go to the region. And for a typical community, you may need to actually hike, walk, take a donkey or a horse to go to actually reach the community. Not every community is like that, but that is a type of community that you may end up. So we're actually talking about a complex setting to do an intervention. Now, the intervention, it all started with some evidence we actually had on a parenting intervention. It was a home-based visits from social workers that work, with the parents to improve parenting practices. As you can see from the results there were some early impacts, and that gives me about 18 more minutes, right? There were some early impacts where showed that actually this home visit actually make a big difference in a lot of behavioral insights that came out of that. What's complicated in a setting like that is that it's very difficult to set these things up, and it's very costly. You can imagine having to costly in time, in cost, and in a lot of dimensions. So we had a very simple idea. How can we explore alternative ways to get information to parents? So phones, we thought penetration of phones in Nicaragua is something like 70-80%. Let's send text messages. So we started thinking of ways to do that. We came up with basically an intervention that had explored different variants of ways that we think different messages would have an impact. So we have variants on the intensity of the messages that and the type of messages, how much health advice or how much stimulation advice you may be getting. We also played about the framing of the messages, so we have a lot of information of variations on the type of messages about motivation, social norms, etc. And we also have variations on who receives the message in the house. Is it the father, the mother, is it both? Because we also understand interactions, spillovers, etc. So given that, we thought, well, this is very simple. All we need to do now, just need to write messages. We need to send them, we evaluate, and then I come here and I talk to you about amazing results. So this was kind of our overconfidence bias on how we can actually implement these things. The important thing, we wanted to do this with the government. So this is not, Renos and the team, just doing this thing. We actually had to develop and make sure that the government actually is comfortable with not only the design and the content, but is actually able to kind of take on their own ability and do that. Wow, amazing. So let me start again. So this is a presentation. No. Okay, so this is a picture of a typical setting. This is what we knew from before. This is a variation. So basically, different people are going to get different variations. We have too many treatment arms to talk about. So this is where we are. So we thought things were easy. So now we have to face reality. So we start designing in detail the things. First thing we realized, well, Facebook penetration actually very low. We don't have data. We don't have admin data that most of the things we usually listen in the last 2 days depend on, or Google searches, etc. So we need to collect data. Okay, this is not hard, but it just takes time to collect the data to do the evaluation. The second thing is we need to come up with the messages. So constructing messages created a lot of kind of a discussion because we don't have just one person making decisions of how to write the messages. I wrote 2 there, but we actually have more. We have people from the Ministry of Health who have their own idea. Ministry of Education have the different idea. Ministry of Social Protection. The police was there because they were interested in violence. We had us, we had psychologists, we had the people in the field who actually know how people understand the language and the messages. So that took a lot of time. I think it was fantastic, but it's not that we wrote messages and then we disappeared. It took about 4-5 months to create messages, test them, pilot them, come back, do another round, etc. So it takes time to go through those. And I think it's fantastic because you learn so much. And I think that's part of this behavioral world is how much you actually learn about these issues. So then we had to create the platform. And then we saw the data from the baseline. We realized that about only a quarter of the people had phones. We thought everybody would have phones because this was the number we had. In reality, in a very complex thing, we didn't have phones. So we went and negotiated with the telephone company. And then we had to deliver phones. Well, day one, we realized that there were local gangs who wanted to steal the phones. So what do? we called the army, who escorted basically for about 2 months the team to deliver the phones. It was successful, but that required an interesting nudge to get the police involved. By the time we finished this, we're 1 year down the line. So then we started implementing. Now, I won't go through all these details, but basically, you see the antenna, you see the community, and basically, I can't tell you how many people live behind that mountain. So all sorts of, yesterday Taylor talked about, make things easy. Yes, send a text message. Sending a text message is fantastically hard. So the signal, the tower has capacity, so messages get deleted or they don't come on time. The timing, we told people at 9 a.m. you get the message, they get it at 2. If they're not there, they have to walk. So it's definitely anything but easy. So we had to work through it. It rains, so the tower disappears. And then we got to the phones. Now the phones, some people have electricity, many do, but sometimes, their adapters break, the battery breaks. Sometimes they have to go to another house to charge, so they don't have it always on. We had the bra gate, which is basically a social kind of attitude where women, for very practical reasons, they don't have pockets, they don't have fancy bags. They actually put the phone in the bra. It gets humid, the phone breaks. So how do we solve the bra gate? The SIM cards expire. These are not, iPhones who have fancy, parts. And as you see from the graph, so every week or so, if you don't put money, actually your chip will not work. And while you may actually be able to receive messages, you were not able to send messages. Now we had integrated a quiz, a weekly quiz, for us to get feedback, and so that created an issue for us. You can see this long in the graph. There is the rate of trivial response. You can see this graph going really sharp down and up. This is when I called the telephone company complaining about that, and then them fixing it the next day. The last issue that came in the implementation is the issue of trust. Now, there's a lot of reason why these people may not trust the local authority. They may not trust somebody with a terrible Greek accent. But basically, we find a lot of little myths popping out here and there that we have to deal about it. Anything from, the phone stuff, it's all about kidnapping our kids. It's about, I heard somebody dying from poisoning. The best story was when we were doing a lot of qualitative work and a mother comes, I was with my kid Pedro, I was screaming at him, all of a sudden pops a message, and I look at it and it says, "Do not yell to Pedro." So despite all of this, and we can talk a little bit about, the type of things you do on an ongoing basis to adapt, it's all in Spanish, the message, but we also get a lot of messages, and in the field, in the qualitative work, we get quite a lot of excitement about basically having access to something that gives you ongoing or information about, where you are. We have some information about, because of the quiz, we know how well we're asking them questions related to the material, so we get feedback from that. But the last point is really a little bit about what Dan and some of the others really brought up to attention. Remember, we gave everybody phones in this design, partly because we wanted to have a pure evaluation of this. So everybody had a phone with the name of a kid assigned, basically. And that people were telling us in their different words that created an amazing representation of, seeing the phone in their house laying around reminded them of their kid and reminded them of the responsibility to be a better parent. And that was, I had listened to Dan's presentation 2-3 months ago, and it all kind of clicked together how, this is not the size of the phone, by the way, that we gave, the big one. But this was a really powerful insights that at least I saw in practice during that process. So when all fails, if anything you should get out of this is the details, really, really matter. And facing reality and our own even biases is challenging, but it's not impossible. And I think the idea of adaptability and really spending time understanding, who everybody actor is in the policy is extremely important. Thank you.
So, Renos, thank you very much for that. And that was a really good reminder that actually this is hard. the practical realities of implementation is hard. And where I sit in DFID, it's notable for me that we do an awful lot of pilots, we do an awful lot of tests, we do an awful lot of RCTs, but actually scaling them and implementing them and doing all this at scale actually is a different level of challenge. And we haven't quite got that right. Now I'm looking at Stuart, who's going to tell me how much time. We've got 15 minutes, okay. So what we're going to do is, I noticed there was a lot of questions that people had unanswered, so keep thinking about your questions. I'm going to come to you in a minute, but I want to come back to the panel on this question of implementation. So one of the striking things when you listen to your presentations and your tests is the importance of the small details of policy. So it's the small details that make a difference. We're talking about the small nudges that make a difference. So how do you ensure an implementation that actually these are carried out as you would expect? Now, how do we avoid the challenges of implementation? So, because you were nodding so vigorously, no, I'm going to... You start, Renos, start.
I mean, so I think presence matters. I think Nava mentioned that she's been working in Zambia for 10 years. I've been working in Nicaragua for more than 15 years, when I was 5-6 years old, basically. and I think having people, and this is a challenge for places like the World Bank, where we sometimes have a tendency to have 15-minute experts, right? To send people here, and then they do a successful thing. Okay, you can apply to 20 other settings. I think understanding that, so finding ways to work around that understanding within a team, setting up a team, which is us, is the policymakers, and then anybody else you can bring. I think that's an instrumental element of that. I mean, and diagnosing a lot of those processes and the step is central, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think that when we think about buy-in of our partners that are implementing on the ground, it's important to think not only basically that buy-in has to be at every single level, because at any level that threat to the integrity of the research design could be at work. And I think, at the very end of my presentation, I touched on this idea of co-generating knowledge together with practitioners and policymakers. It's so different when they believe it's their experiment, and they really need to know the answer to it. And so at that point, then they're very committed to figuring out what it would take. And in our case, for example, because we had this very small, subtle difference in posters, in recruitment posters, we actually went with the government and we all sat down in the Lusaka office and filled boxes for each district separately, and then sent those boxes to the district officers and then double checked that. And so I think both getting buy-in and accompanying at each stage, which requires not being what they call in Zambia a mosquito researcher, like coming in, getting blood and leaving, So it really does both accompanying and getting buy-in at all levels.
I suppose it raises for me a question as well about the cost of implementation and the whole issue of cost effectiveness. So, what is interesting about many of your presentations is that we see the results, but the question is, what is the value of those results compared to the cost of implementation? That's one of the issues we don't quite often see in many of these experiments is the cost effectiveness of experiments. In due course, it might be interesting to hear your views on that. But let me open up to the audience. We'll follow the same process that Anna did. We'll ask 2 questions, and then we'll go back to the panel. So, woman here.
Well, I have 2 questions for everybody. Thank you. 2 questions for everybody. One, if you resorted to any kind of crowdsourcing contributions method of collecting information from the communities that were going to receive the strategies, if you got them previously, like ideas, suggestions on how they could be designed and the strategies, the nudges, whatever. And the second one, what's the secret to get the governments to go along with all these innovative ways of adopting behavioral insights and all that?
So two questions in one there.
She had 2 questions. Do we give her, is this like the end?
I'm going to get a 3rd question, actually. Woman with the hand up there.
Thank you. Dan Ariely in particular mentioned culture, and that's a theme that's come up I'll start over. Dan Ariely mentioned culture, and culture is an issue that has come up a number of times. For example, in Kahneman's talk as well. And I have a question about the specific response that Dan gave today. As I understood it, Dan said that culture matters when you're talking about social constructions. And the implications seem to be, if you're not talking about social constructions, it doesn't matter. Certainly, we all have the same visual capacity. We can all learn to count. But it seems to me that the results that were just put up 5 minutes ago on how you get the answer wrong if it's about an ideologically charged issue, but you get it right when it's about a non-ideologically charged issue like skin cream, I think Stefan Dercon put that up, suggests that we bring in social constructions even to questions that have nothing to do with a social construction, but simply how do we interpret some numbers on a particular chart. And it seems more generally to me that we always have issues of attention and construal, and thus I would be interested in Dan's response and perhaps everybody else's response to whether it really is true that we can separate culture out or whether we have to deal with it more generally.
Okay, great. So can the panel cover those three questions, one of which is specifically for Dan? Who wants to start?
Maybe I can start with the question about the government buy-in. As Renos and the other speakers were alluding to, building relationship is a critical component of this. And actually, if the implementer believes that the experience of their own, they're much more inclined to test, learn, and adapt. And in the case of taxes, just like we were discussing for the other policy areas, sitting down, writing the messages with the tax authorities, having the concurrence of the ministries of finance, you have the legal departments, implementation departments, you have the people that review the taxes, you have the guys that work in the call center and they actually talk to the taxpayers on a regular basis, and getting those feedback and actually building something together, it's very important. And actually for some of the initial trials that we have been doing, there's also a lot of flexibility that goes on into it. The tax authorities have specific questions of what works, and like most policymakers do, which is sometimes, a little bit different than the mindsets of researchers that may want to have very, very, very small twitches to actually see exactly what works, or, what is the impact of one of those. So actually having a balance on this is very important.
Yeah, just maybe add on this question of the secrets to try to government take it seriously. Well, it's just two aspects to it. It is hard work, and it is, you have to really show it's in its interest to do so. I'm thinking of an example, work I was involved in Kenya, replicating and expanding some work, all trying to do education better, but where the Minister of Education threw us out of his office and said, you're not going to experiment on our children, which clearly suggests that we may have approached it a little bit in the wrong way. But you need to try to do. But also I would make a distinction between government here, the policymakers, the ones who make the decisions, and actually also the officials, the civil servants, which is actually quite different incentives that are playing in it. And sometimes I have the impression that people who try to do this don't really disentangle these and let's just say it's all just the same. It is not the same, I can assure you. There's different incentives driving each of them. And then maybe just a final thought, it's maybe not surprising that in terms of getting behavioral insight adopted in governments across the world, that in collecting taxes we seem to make an awful lot of progress, but in spending the money wisely we get a little bit less progress.
Just a couple of thoughts. I think we are, at least in my job, I always find it, in a way, we're privileged and lucky to be able to work at different levels. So within a ministry, I may have access to the minister, I may have access to the vice minister, but I also have access to the technical team. And that allows me to, in a way, to have a discussion about, what they're interested in solving, whether there are problems at different levels, including the technical ones. So when the discussion about being, having a, my brilliant idea and how we're gonna, if it's useful or not. I think that allows that space, especially from the technical discussion and then going up. The other thing that I pretty much say in all of my first meetings in any counterpart, I tell them that, Anna pays my salary, I'm free labor, and I'm there to help solve the problems, which is true in many ways. I have no idea about lending. We don't work in lending in our team. We work about the analytics and these type of things. And somehow, which goes to a little bit what Nava was saying, making this connection that, I am part of a team, of an extended team, that I'm, away, just a Skype phone call away, makes important, and then engaging and being committed to that, and that's partly why I really don't like working in too many countries, because I do value, I think that's very elemental. On the crowd sourcing, I mean, if I understood the question, do we get ideas from the beneficiaries and the users? And absolutely, we do a lot of qualitative work, a lot of different types of visits. I mean, we got some of the most interesting ideas we've gotten from random NGOs that we just got lucky enough to visit and get ideas about what worked for them and how to start scaling it up, etc.
So actually, we're running short of time, so I'm just going to ask for one more question. I know Dan's going to answer the culture question. We'll come back to you, Nava, as well, because you've got something to say. So last question from the audience. So you've had your hand up for quite some time. I'll go for you.
Thank you. I'm Donna Harris from University of Oxford. So I'm a behavioral economist as well, and I'm glad that we're talking about policies and bringing behavioral insights into it. But we also know that people are prone to status quo bias, and now it's all new and exciting. But what about when things like this become a norm and become something that's a status quo? Where do we go from there?
Okay. Great, thank you. So, Nava, you want to say something?
Sure, I actually just want to talk about where the ideas that come from. I think my favorite way of designing interventions is to look and see who the positive deviants are in the community, who are basically solving the problem, say a problem of trying to get yourself to save. So who are the people who are doing, for example, we did this when we were trying to design a commitment savings product, and then we designed it the way that the best people in the community had figured out to keep themselves from spending money. And that allows it to be culturally, appropriate, but then takes it from there.
So let me first answer the easy question. And the easy question is, how do we make this to keep seeming exciting? And I think for me, the notion is that we really have to mandate experimentation. Think about the FDA in the US. Every time you want to put a medication out, you have to test it. And there's no question, do you feel like it? Oh, it feels old. No, you have to do it. I think for me, social science in general and behavioral economics is really a lesson in humility. You basically tell yourself what I think will happen, and then other things happen. And you remind yourself almost every day that you're wrong. And this continuous reminder of how wrong we are, I think it's a really wonderful practice. I would like it to be illegal for legislators and regulators to basically use their own intuition to regulate. Right? That's basically what we do. Somebody has an idea, they can argue nicely, they have a nice British accent, all of a sudden this become, it's kind of a crazy system if you think about it. And the amount of damage we can create, I think, is sometimes higher than in the medical market, right? But we just don't see it in the same way. So I think we just need to have, at some point, I hope that's what will happen. We'll say this is the rule. You have to have an FDA-like process if you want to pass anything. Show us that it's really working. Now, in terms of the difficult question, I think you've always asked me such difficult questions every time. So I think that the example is actually the example that the moment you put something that is emotionally laden, people behave differently. I think it's part of the cultural construction. So what do we think we care about? Well, this week we care about babies of immigrants that are being washed on the shore. If the question was phrased like that, we would care a lot more. Next week we'll care about something else. So think about something like self-control. In general, people have self-control problems. We all have self-control problems. Now, if you remember what happened with Japan after the tsunami, you would see pictures of Japanese people standing in line in an orderly way. And as an Israeli, I knew that this will never happen in Israel. Nobody stands in line generally, but when there's a nuclear disaster. And you could say, well, the Japanese have such self-control, it's just unbelievable. And we also know about saving rates. But have you ever been in a bar in Japan? Right? All of a sudden, they don't seem like they have much self-control. And I think that, for me, is kind of the issue. There are some behaviors that we just follow our natures, and there are some behaviors that are wrapped in some overarching metaphor from society or something cultural. So the moment you put numbers up there, and they're called numbers, it's kind of like perception. The moment you put the number and you give them a social meaning, you're moving into the social. Now, is it one or the other? No, there's a continuum, and there's a question of how much is it kind of the pure cognitive vision-like, and how much is it fully socially embedded. And we need to figure out where we are, and the more we are on the pure socially embedded, the more we need to test things in every context again.
Dan, thank you. And we've run out of time. I know there are more questions, and I know probably our panelists want to say a few things as well. So it's always a good spot to finish on, is when there's still more debate to be had. So my last task is to thank you all for coming, for listening, for engaging. And could I ask you all to give a round of thanks to Anna, our moderator, and our 5 panelists today. Thank you.